2024's worst SUVs that you need to avoid, whether it's a matter of poor reliability, aggressive depreciation, or styling that's enough to choke a horse. I'm going to share a list of 10 of the worst SUVs for 2024 you're definitely going to want to avoid if you like your money and you want a fun, stylish vehicle. Let's get into it now.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
The first one on the list of SUVs you're probably going to want to avoid for 2024 is one that there was rumored to actually go through a major style change for the 24 model year, but in actuality now it looks more like it's pushed back at least to 2025 and possibly beyond. What we have in front of us here is a late model 5th generation Chevy Tahoe. As you can see, it's a short back end. It's not the Suburban, the full length. This is a sporty, full-size, half-ton vehicle right here that can do a lot of towing, 7,900 pounds of towing capacity, and has a lot of room for passengers, although that's one of the complaints, is not as much room as one would think given the size of this vehicle. As versatile as the Tahoe may appear, there's way too many issues that I just can't recommend this vehicle. Yeah, it's a full-size SUV, and if you need to do your towing and your hauling, that might answer the question for you. But let me get into some of the big issues. Well, there's been lots of complaints about suspension and banging and bushings and noise, particularly from the front end of these vehicles. Another big problem with some of these are these door handles, and a lot of people are complaining that they'll break off. You pull them too hard and they just rip out of your hands. As a matter of fact, it's funny, I was driving on the road yesterday and I saw one. I was driving and the gentleman was from California and that whole door handle assembly was missing. So that's not uncommon for the Yukons. It's also a common issue for the Escalades, as well as a lot of the half-ton, three-quarter-ton pickup trucks. The air conditioning system has lots of issues there, as well as electronics in general. Did you also hear about the automatic transmission? That has also been a real sore spot for a lot of owners, as well as a lot of the recalls hitting GM for that particular transmission. The engine is another problem area where GM's been fighting off a lot of different recalls related to that engine. 5.3 and even some of the 6.2 liter engines you're finding by GM in the Cadillacs as well as the Chevy products, where you're getting broken lifters, rockers, where you start misfiring check engine lights, and it often means the manufacturer having to strip apart the top end of the engine, rebuild either a bank or both of the banks on that V8 engine. So as attractive and versatile as these vehicles may be, they're just not necessarily built for reliability. Yeah, the U-beam suspension means it's good for a lot of banging around on rough roads, but unfortunately many body parts are very fragile. The engine's going to likely see problems, as will the transmission. It's just a fragile vehicle. Oil leaks, transmission slipping, engine knocking, and a whole host of other issues you would anticipate with the Chevy Tahoe. And the next SUV for 2024 I definitely wouldn't advise buying. It's this little Jeep product here. Yes, Stellantis. In other words, a product of a brutal environment. As a matter of fact, a lot of these Jeep products have been a source of many issues. Now, they have done some things for these late model versions that have made them a little bit better. The sad part is, unfortunately, even though they've improved the over the 9-speed automatic transmission and they've replaced it with an 8-speed auto, which is more reliable because the outgoing one was a source of some recalls, wiring issues, as well as some failures and faults. They've changed it to the 8-speed, which so far appears to be slightly more dependable. The other issue was a lot of times the engine is not as efficient as it should be. The outgoing engine was poor in terms of overall fuel economy, and even the newer upgraded 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder engine still only manages to muster up about 25 miles to the gallon in the city and only about 31, 32 on the highway, making it certainly not overly economical to run either. I mean, just look at some of the parts on here. It's a very basic vehicle, but it's not going for basic money. Back in the day, $30,000 would get you a pretty nice vehicle. Well, today, that's just where this game starts. You can go all the way up to almost 45 grand to get in one of these when it's all dressed up. I mean, the headlights are still old school version. This front grille, very basic, and while they use a little bit of its piano gloss black finishing and a beautiful 19-inch set of upgraded rims, this little compass right here has such a basic interior that it's really literally nothing to write home about. And even with the large glass panel on top and a few nice little upgrades, by the time you dress this dog up, you're going to expect to pay well over 40 grand, which I just don't see the value add. Also to add, because it's a Jeep product, the early warning signs are there. So far, the reliability doesn't look horrible. It's not as bad as some of the other Stellantis products. However, if history is known to repeat itself, and it usually does, the Jeep Compass is certainly one that I would personally avoid in 2024. The next SUV for 2024 that I can't recommend, it's just getting long in the tooth, it's getting very old. The 5th generation Ford Exploder, the official Karen Mobile. This is not the current generation. In 2022, they upgraded it yet again, so things have changed a little bit, but what hasn't changed is the quality of the vehicle. Now, as a matter of fact, in 2022, the latest 6th generation Ford Exploder, a lot of customers are complaining transmissions are harder shifting, buzzy engines, a lot of harsh driving. Obviously, the dynamics mean the vehicle is a little rougher to drive. It's a little more edgy as well. Other problems that you can actually anticipate. Let's take a look right here. Why do we have rust peeling and bubbling away on the hood? Why is that happening? But that isn't uncommon for a lot of these vehicles. It's very rough and lacks its luster feel. Of course, also down here, why do we have this exhaust tip missing when that one over there is existing and this one's just no longer there? Clearly, parts fall off and it's not a well-made vehicle. We also have plastics here popping holes. It's not uncommon to find trim-related issues like this peeling away, and even the interior is not all that well made. So while there's a lot of fanatics about the Ford Exploder, the fact remains is it's not as polished as it could be. Quality control isn't quite where it should be, especially considering the cost of these vehicles. And did you know a few generations ago you had some of these that would choke people out because of carbon monoxide poisoning? That's right, there's storylines where even police officers were driving these, idling for a period of time, and then they would fill the cabin with carbon monoxide, absolutely choking somebody out. So there's clearly quality control issues here. It's built in typical Ford fashion and not one that I would definitely recommend for 2024. Another one on the list, that's one that you probably want to avoid for a while, just because it's so new. In 2022, this little hot rod came out, lots of problems. Why, what's going on here? Well, it's an attractive looking little unit, tiny subcompact SUV by Volkswagen. What is it? Of course, as we see the big VW, great new headlights and beautiful high gloss wheels. This is the Taos, as we can see, gorgeous touches all the way along. And it has a lot of great styling along the side. Looks very typical Audi and Volkswagen, but it does have the wonderful LED rear tail lights. Of course, there it is, backup camera, fake exhaust cutouts. There's actually no exhaust coming out of there. It's all way under here. Very well built, sturdy and stout, guaranteed to last a long time, at least on the inside of the vehicle. But the problem is there have been some issues that would make me shy away because it's a newer model. Well, there's been a lot of electrical gremlins and issues popping up there. There's also been jerky transmissions and transmission failures, and that engine hasn't exactly been the most stout. Electrical problems, jerkiness, but the big issue is fuel problems with this vehicle. And when I say that, we're talking about fuel leaks. Yes, this had to go back to the manufacturer to get leaks sorted out because fuel would potentially leak from the fittings under the hood. And I personally know somebody who had a deposit on one, actually took the vehicle on possession, drove it, the recall came out, and then of course they had to give the vehicle back. They had sat in a shop and waited, and it was just not worth the hassle. Fuel leaks, transmission, engine problems, electric gremlins, and even stalling, if you can believe that, have been a problem. Shouldn't be an issue in modern day vehicles, but it has been a problem. It's just too early and it just wasn't quite ready for production. So the Volkswagen Taos, one for me, I would personally say, let it put a little seat time in and give it the opportunity to show it what it can do, because for now, it's a bit of a risk for 2024. And here's the next one on the list. Now, what we have here clearly is a Chevy product, and it is the Equinox. It's also very similar to the GMC Terrain, which is more or less built on the same chassis, same drivetrain components, and many of the same shared components throughout the vehicle that makes them just a personal choice, because they are essentially the same vehicle. So we can wrap this conversation up 2 for 1 here. But this is a very problematic vehicle. Underpowered, low quality, and problematic in general. Definitely not one worth buying in 2024. Let me explain a little bit more about this vehicle. Firstly, the quality finishing is not very high quality. We're dealing with very hard plastics, a very dull looking set of taillights on these vehicles. You don't have amenities like sunroofs as a base. And even though you have some nice trim detail like this, the interior feels very, very basic, poorly put together, and quite frankly, very entry level. Now, while the front end looks quite sporty and spicy, The problem is more or less this new 1.5 liter turbo engine. Allegedly, there's been fuel pump issues with stalling, causing issues there. The older outgoing 2.4 liter was a heavy oil consumer. This one not quite as much, but there are transmission related troubles here. That engine is underpowered. We're also hearing stories as well about the brakes failing inadvertently and some problems with the occupancy system. Of course, the airbag occupancy detection system, which detects whether you have a child or somebody smaller in the front passenger, where you don't want the airbag to go off if they're in there and in the event of a collision. But there have been storylines already or allegedly where that fails, and it puts that person at a huge risk if this vehicle is actually in a collision. So it's clearly not a well put together vehicle, low quality and quite pricey for actually what it is. Definitely one to avoid in 2024. And then moving on to the next SUV that I would strongly advise you stay away from. In 2024, to note though, this particular vehicle is going through a substantial change in its overall architecture. Likely engine, body, chassis design. There will be some changes going on with this particular model. But again, if history repeats itself, there will be likely some things you really want to think about. This vehicle has had a lot of problems. Number one, the front collision avoidance system here has been known to fail from time to time. There's also been talks about brakes failing in unfortunate circumstances. As well, we can't forget about some of the big issues. Oil consumption in that engine. As well, you know the piston rings? Those are the things that seal your piston compression in the engine. Well, those have been known to crack, hang up, and score the cylinders. In other words, it ends up resulting in damaged cylinder walls, pistons, and ultimately catastrophic engine boom failures. Also, oil consumption's a problem, and as well, transmission failures have been known to be significant in these vehicles. Can't forget about some of the electrical gremlins in these vehicles too, and it's just the list goes on. And as a matter of fact, it's rounded out 2 out of 5 stars in terms of overall predicted reliability from the previous generation. Even if the next 2024 revamp is much improved, likeliness, it's like they say, you never buy the first of every model or any model, and that's why I'd suggest, even though it's changing, steer clear away from the Hyundai Kona. And the next SUV I would strongly advise staying away from for 2024 is, if you don't like body panels that don't line up like that, or you see other body panels that line up like that, whereas the other side lines up a little better, door handles that don't open all the way in the winter, rims that are designed to get gouged and scratched, way too much technology abound that fails at a drop of a hat, very blasé looking interior with materials that wear out very, very soon, cheap plastic finishing that does not inspire confidence, and generally vehicles that have lots of fires attributed to the particular name brand, allegedly of course. Let me share a little story. I had a rental like this a couple years ago and I drove it and it was flawless. Open the door, you get in, the screen lights up in the middle. Open the door, screen lights up, and this went on and on. One time it didn't come on, the door opened, but the screen didn't light up. But guess what? That screen is the only way to actually properly engage and drive this vehicle. Now, sadly, Tesla Model Y doesn't really qualify as a luxury vehicle. I have featured the Model X, the upscale version, in the conversation about luxury SUVs to avoid. But the Model Y definitely falls under the criteria of vehicles to avoid, strictly because now some of the mandates I've heard recently too, some of these governments are actually retracting, or some of the bills that were put in place to mandate the use of pure EV in the industry as a whole by 2030 or 2035. Some of these bills are being amended, and some of this is changing again because people believe the infrastructure will never be there. It's never going to be there on time. I've had conversations with the business development people at local utilities, and they tell me that they keep pushing these dates out to 35, 40, 50 now. And even at 2050, they say it's not likely ever going to happen. The other conversation is getting up to some of those electric chargers with these vehicles can be a real problem. If you plug in and it even works at all, you count yourself lucky. That's usually only after you have a lineup of 3 or 4 people in front of you. And if you have to wait on a supercharger for 30 minutes, count yourself lucky, because the non-superchargers can take anywhere from 8 to 12 or even 24 hours to charge your vehicle. Can't forget about the battery changes. Have you seen the depreciation on these vehicles? Hold on to this thing for 10 years and then find out what heavy depreciation is all about. When people realize 10 year to 12 years is the limit for the batteries, and then you're actually having to dole out $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 for a new set of batteries. Depreciation goes up in smoke. So the Tesla Model Y does qualify as an SUV I'd personally avoid in 2024. And that moves us to another one that's literally a disaster. Here's another glorified minivan on wheels that they're trying to prop up to make it seem like something a little bit that it's actually not. I would not recommend this for 2024 for a few reasons. Number one, of course, this is actually built on the Ford Escape or Escape chassis. Yes, drivetrain's all the same vehicle essentially. The difference is they're asking more money for this because it's carrying this fancy little badge, and this beautiful brand name means that people are going to get pulled into that. This is not to be mistaken for the full-size Bronco that carries a V6. This is the little 4-cylinder version right here. Paint quality. A lot of these little Ford Bronco Sports don't have the greatest of paint quality. There's definitely, oh, the bird's got a hold of that one. And clearly this one doesn't look very bad, but that has been noted by a lot of customers. There's other issues where people have complained about the brakes not working that well and not are up to the task. There's also been complaints about the engine itself, and it sounds very rattly. So when you're flooring it, it starts to knock and ping. Some of that's just detonation due to low grade of fuel with too little octane, but the fact remains it's a very susceptible engine to those types of failures, potentially could lead to catastrophic engine damage in the future. Another big one that some people have talked about already is cracked fuel injectors leaking fuel, raw fuel, into the engine compartment. And what do you think happens if you spray hot explosive fuel onto a hot exhaust manifold? I think that doesn't end very well, and I think the bottom line is there are some quality control challenges with this vehicle. It's also not built on its own sturdy platform, rather a small minivan, tiny SUV chassis, unibody style. It's clearly not built for the task. It's a little more chic vehicle to drive around in, but honestly, if you're looking for something like this, there are many, many great choices. Maybe step into the Tacoma by Toyota if you just want something rough and tumble that can also take on some of the off-road duties. And there's the next one on the list I would personally avoid for 2024. It hasn't been around clearly long enough. What it is obviously a Dodge product, but it actually shares the same platform as an Alfa Romeo. Have you ever heard of the Alfa Romeo Toenail, or Tonale as they say? Yes, in fact, this is the same vehicle, different platform, of course, in terms of the name and a little bit of the styling changes, but basically the underpinnings, drivetrain, so it clearly brings a little bit Italian sensation to the conversation, if you will. But there haven't been a lot of these out there on the road yet. The reality is there have been a few customers already chalking up to a lot of check engine lights, electrical gremlins, problems in the electrics in general. Now, the drivetrains are plenty stout and peppy, but it has to do so far with some of the electrics. It's a little early in the game, but predicted reliability for the Dodge Hornet, like we're looking at right here, isn't all that good. I mean, yes, it has very undersized rear brakes on there, and of course it does have some very interesting styling, and I love that light bar at the back, but it's some of the electrics related to the trunk lid may be problematic. Some of the lighting technology may be an issue, and time will tell, but historically we know transmissions and Chrysler, Jeep, Stellantis products often are slightly compromised. So just for the sake of playing it safe, I would suggest wait 2 or 3 more years. If it holds up as a better reliability or durability, then maybe go for it. For now, 2024, I'd stay away from the Hornet. And the next SUV that barely qualifies as one, but let's throw it in there because it sort of does. Has the 4-wheel drive system, has 4 doors, a rear trunk lid, so there's clearly lots of space, and it does more or less meet the criteria and intent. It's a lot of the Stellantis products, not just by the Jeep Wrangler that we're looking at here, but the Wagoneers, the Grand Wagoneers are grossly overpriced. That's why this manufacturer is one of those that has way more volume on the lots than they should have, because A, they're overpriced. So if you are going to buy this vehicle for 2024, you're probably going to pay way more than you should, although there might be some incentives rolling in because now Dodge is getting a little bit nervous, and so is Stellantis as a general with the Ram and Jeep products. You may want to look at getting into one generally from a strong, aggressive incentive perspective, but if they're not offering incentives, don't even bother. One, you can get water ingress right there. Because this is a removable roof here, there's often opportunities for water to get inside inside the cabin and fill this vehicle up like a fishbowl. Of course, we also have squeaks, rattles, noise, and the like. It's a rough ride, so only for those that really do need that off-roading capability, I wouldn't even consider driving these for day-to-day use. They're hard to get in and out of, and of course, they're just very impractical. They're heavy on fuel. That V6 engine, the 3.6, is not a great engine, even though it's used in many vehicles. The earlier generations have had lots of problems. We do have known issues related to suspension problems under here, because that suspension gets loose with time, and you have a phenomenon called death wobble. All the play and the bushings and all the links become sloppy and loose. Because that vehicle's designed to be flexible already because of the off-road prowess, it just exaggerates and exacerbates the issues, and you end up with a scenario where you call death wobble. Yeah, in fact, that's basically the vehicle starts getting out of control, starts getting a little bit loose on the front end at highway speeds and becomes dangerous. But there's other problems. We also talk about the throttle position sensor, where the vehicle starts to hunt up and down. You get surging and hunting. You have coolant leaks. You actually have oil leaks as well, and generally the plastics inside are not the best put together. The finishing is not the most stout and quite downgraded from considering the cost of these vehicles. We also can't forget about the infamous tip-em, which does impact your electrics, from your lights to your power windows to a lot of your gauges. They can come, they can go. And yeah, because your tip-em, your totally integrated power module, has been known to fail. It's an exclusively a Dodge, Stellantis, Ram type product issue, where the centralized module controls all your input outputs, and it fails, and it's pricey. And when they do, all those electrics come and go, or they just go out completely. It actually controls your fuel pump and a lot of your other electrics. So it can be a problem with reliability and significant costs associated with taking care of that repair. Generally speaking, most of these vehicles from the Jeep, Ram product lineup generally are not the most reliable, and quite frankly are a little overpriced by today's standards. So that's one I would steer away from for 2024. And with all of that said, check it out right there. If you want to step up your game and you want to go towards the luxury SUV, those are the ones you're probably going to want to avoid, because they are some of the worst. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you all real soon. Bye-bye.